Sometimes the most innocent words spoken by a child can change a man's heart forever. We all remember making promises we thought we'd never have to keep. In the small town of Copper Hollow, 8-year-old Josie McGraw looked up at giant rancher Boone Carter and said, "I'll marry you when I grow up." Boone just smiled. She was only a child. Her family moved away. He stayed behind, working his ranch and burying his parents. 16 years passed. Then one day, a stagecoach arrived in town. Out stepped a beautiful woman with familiar eyes. It was Josie, all grown up. She had come back to Copper Hollow, but she wasn't the same little girl who left. She carried secrets and pain from her past. What brought her back after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Hollow, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. Boone Carter stood on the porch of McKinnon's General Store, his massive frame silhouetted against the brightening sky. At 45, he remained an imposing figure, 6 feet 4 inches of weathered muscle and quiet strength, with hands large enough to gentle a spooked horse or mend a broken fence post with equal ease. He pulled his father's pocket watch from his vest, the tarnished silver catching the early light. 7:30. Same time he'd been coming to town for supplies every Tuesday morning for the past 20 years. The watch had belonged to 3 generations of Carter men, each one adding their own scratches and dents to its surface. His grandfather had carried it through the war between the states. His father had consulted it during the long cattle drives of his youth. Now it marked the steady, predictable rhythm of Boone's solitary life. The town itself bore the marks of hard times, paint peeled from the church steeple. Half the businesses that had thrived in his childhood now stood empty, their windows dark and dusty. The railroad had passed them by 5 years ago, choosing a route through Millbrook instead. Since then, Copper Hollow had been slowly bleeding people and prosperity. But it was home, and Boone Carter wasn't the kind of man to abandon something just because it required patience and hard work to sustain. "Morning, Boone." Doc Henley emerged from his office across the street, medical bag in hand. At 72, the doc remained the town's most reliable constant, delivering babies and tending the sick with the same steady competence he'd shown for 4 decades. His white hair caught the breeze as he crossed toward the general store. "Doc," Boone touched the brim of his hat, "Mrs. Patterson's baby keeping you busy?" "Came into the world at 3 this morning, hollering loud enough to wake half the county." The older man's eyes crinkled with satisfaction. "Strong lungs on that one. Makes number 7 for the Pattersons." Boone managed to smile, though something twisted in his chest. 7 children. A legacy that would carry the Patterson name forward long after the parents were gone. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the doctor's weathered face. "That's good news for all of us. Town could use more young families." Doc Henley studied him with the knowing gaze of a man who'd seen too much of life's disappointments. "Speaking of families, you ever think about starting one of your own? 45 isn't too old to begin again." The question hit like a familiar ache. Boone had heard variations of it from every well-meaning soul in Copper Hollow. Each time, he offered the same response, a non-committal grunt and a change of subject. This morning proved no different. "Ranch keeps me plenty busy." He tucked the watch back into his vest pocket. "Pete's waiting on these supplies." Inside McKinnon's store, Martha McKinnon looked up from her inventory ledger. She'd been running the business since her husband's death 8 years ago, transforming herself from a banker's wife into one of the shrewdest merchants in 3 counties. Her grey hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her dress showed the careful mending of someone who understood the value of making things last. "The usual order, Boone?" "Yes, ma'am, plus an extra sack of oats. Pete thinks the mayor might be expecting." Martha's face brightened. "That's wonderful news. Your father would be proud to see the ranch thriving." Would he? Boone wondered. His father had built the Rocking Sea Ranch with dreams of a dynasty, sons and grandsons working the land, each generation building on the last. Instead, There was only Boone, aging alone in a house too big for one man, watching his bloodline approach its end. The bell above the door chimed as Widow Morrison entered, her black dress rustling against the floorboards. At 68, Eleanor Morrison remained the unofficial guardian of Copper Hollow's moral compass, dispensing advice and casseroles with equal generosity. She'd been in mourning for her husband for 12 years now, though Boone suspected she kept wearing black more from habit than grief. "Boone Carter, you're exactly the man I needed to see." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I've been thinking about your birthday celebration." "Ma'am?" "Don't you ma'am me, young man. 45 years deserves proper recognition. I'm organizing a gathering at the church hall. Saturday evening, the whole town will attend." Boone felt heat rise in his cheeks. The last thing he wanted was a public reminder of another year passing without the milestones other men his age had achieved. No wife to plan such celebrations. No children to carry forward his name. Just another revolution of his father's pocket watch, marking time that felt increasingly borrowed. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Morrison, but nothing. A man reaches 45 only once. Besides, this town needs reasons to come together." Her eyes softened slightly. "Your parents would have wanted it." The mention of his parents silenced any further protest. His mother had died when he was 37, taken by pneumonia, during a particularly harsh winter. His father had followed 2 years later, some said from grief, though Doc Henley called it a weak heart. Boone had buried them both in the family plot behind the ranch house, under cottonwoods his grandfather had planted as saplings. "All right, Mrs. Morrison. Saturday evening." Her smile transformed her stern features. "Excellent, Martha. We'll need to coordinate the refreshments." As the two women began planning, Boone gathered his supplies and loaded them into his wagon. The familiar routine provided comfort, each item checked off his mental list, every movement purposeful and measured. This was his life, predictable, useful, solitary. The ride back to the ranch took him along the winding dirt road that followed Copper Creek. The water ran low this time of year, exposing smooth stones and creating small pools where cattle came to drink. His father had chosen this location for the ranch because of the reliable water source, building the main house on a slight rise that provided views of the surrounding valley. The house itself was a testament to Carter ambition, 2 stories of solid timber construction, with a wide front porch and enough bedrooms for the large family his father had envisioned. Now most of those rooms stood empty, their furniture covered with dust sheets, their windows shuttered against the light. Pete Williams was waiting in the barn when Boone arrived. At 22, Pete represented everything Boone might have been in another life, eager, optimistic, full of plans for a future that seemed bright with possibility. He'd been working the ranch for 3 years, ever since his own father's farm had failed during the drought. "Morning, boss. How's town?" "Quiet." Doc delivered another Patterson baby. Pete grinned. "Number 7, right? Tom Patterson's aiming to populate the whole county by himself." As they unloaded the supplies, Boone found himself studying the young man's easy confidence. Pete had a sweetheart, Mary Collins, the preacher's daughter, and they planned to marry come spring. The boy talked constantly about his plans, a small spread of his own, children, a life built on hope rather than memory. "Mrs. Morrison's planning a birthday celebration for me Saturday night," Boone said, hefting a sack of grain. "That's great. The whole town will turn out, might even convince some of the girls from Millbrook to make the trip." Pete's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Time you found yourself a wife, boss. Man your age shouldn't be rattling around that big house alone." There it was again, the assumption that a man wasn't complete without a family, that solitude equaled failure. Boone had heard it so often he'd almost convinced himself it was true. Almost. That evening, he sat on his front porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. The house stretched behind him, its many rooms echoing with the ghost of conversations that had never taken place. His father's study, where no son had ever learned the business of ranching. His mother's sewing room, where no daughter-in-law had ever mended clothes for grandchildren. He pulled out the pocket watch again, running his thumb over its worn surface. Time passed, whether a man made his mark or not. Stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, same as they had when he was a boy, dreaming of adventure beyond the valley's borders. Same as they would long after he was gone, and someone else owned the rocking sea. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another from the opposite ridge. Lonely calls across the darkness, seeking connection in the vast emptiness of night. Boone understood that loneliness had made peace with it years ago, or thought he had. Tomorrow would bring the same routine, checking cattle, mending fences, managing the endless details that kept a ranch running. Next week would mirror this one, and the month after would pass in similar fashion. It was a good life, he told himself. Honest work, land that provided, neighbors who respected him. Many men had far less. Yet, as he prepared for bed in the house his father had built for a growing family, Boone couldn't shake the feeling that something essential remained unfinished. Not just the obvious things, marriage, children, legacy, but something deeper. A promise made long ago that he'd forgotten how to keep. He wound his father's watch carefully, its steady tick marking the passage of another day in a life that felt suspended between what had been and what might still be possible. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called to its mate, receiving an answer that carried across the darkness like hope itself. In the morning, everything would change. But tonight, Boone Carter sat alone with his thoughts and the weight of time, unaware that destiny approached Copper Hollow on the next day's stage, carrying secrets that would transform his careful, solitary world into something richer and more complex than he had ever dared imagine. The stagecoach arrived on Wednesday afternoon with the thunderous rumble that always drew half the town to their windows. Boone was shoeing a horse behind the blacksmith's shop when he heard the familiar sound of iron wheels on packed earth, followed by the driver's sharp whistle that announced passengers for Copper Hollow. He straightened slowly, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. The August heat made even simple tasks feel monumental, and he'd been wrestling with the mare's stubborn hoof for the better part of an hour. Through the gap between buildings, he could see the dust cloud settling around Murphy's stage depot. "That'll be the 3 o'clock from Denver," called Tom Murphy, emerging from his office to greet the new arrivals. At 58, Tom had been running the depot for 20 years, and he took pride in knowing every passenger's business before they'd step down from the coach. Boone finished with the horse and ambled toward the main street, drawn by idle curiosity more than genuine interest. Passengers were rare enough in Copper Hollow to warrant attention, though they usually turned out to be traveling salesmen or distant relatives visiting for brief, awkward reunions. A small crowd had gathered around the coach Martha McKinnon, Doc Henley, a few of the store clerks taking advantage of a break in their afternoon routines. The driver, a grizzled man named Joe Beckett, was unloading luggage from the coach's rear boot with his usual efficiency. "Just the one passenger today," Joe announced to no one in particular. "Lady traveling light, paid for the full fare to Denver but asked to stop here instead." The coach door opened, and a woman's gloved hand appeared, grasping the frame as she prepared to step down. Boone found himself moving closer, something about the graceful way she emerged from the cramped interior, catching his attention. She was tall, taller than most women he knew, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a simple but well-made traveling hat. Her dress was practical but elegant, the deep blue fabric unmarked by the dust that covered everything else in town. As her feet touched the ground, she turned toward the gathered crowd, and Boone felt the world shift beneath him like a fault line giving way. Those eyes, green as spring grass, with the same determined spark he remembered from 16 years ago. The face had matured, losing the soft roundness of childhood and gaining the sculpted cheekbones of womanhood, but the essential spirit remained unchanged. Josie McGraw had come home. She stood for a moment, scanning the faces around her with the careful assessment of someone who expected trouble. When her gaze found Boone, she went completely still. Recognition flickered across her features, followed by something harder to read. Surprise, certainly, but also a wariness that hadn't been there when she was 8 years old. "Well, I'll be damned," breathed Doc Henley, loud enough for half the street to hear. Josie McGraw, grown up and pretty as a picture. The sound of her name seemed to break whatever spell had frozen both of them in place. Josie stepped forward, her chin lifted in a gesture. Boone remembered from childhood the same defiant tilt she'd worn when declaring her intention to marry him someday. "Hello, Mr. Carter." Her voice had deepened, carrying traces of education and experience that hadn't been there before. "I hope you remember me." "I remember." The words came out rougher than he'd intended. You've... He stopped, suddenly aware that half the town was listening to his attempts at conversation. "You've grown up." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I had that in mind when I left." Joe Beckett cleared his throat and gestured toward a worn leather traveling bag sitting beside the coach. "This yours, miss?" "Yes, thank you." Josie reached for the bag, but Boone was already moving, his instincts taking over before his mind could catch up. "I'll get that." Their hands brushed as he lifted the bag, and he was struck by how light it was. Whatever had brought her back to Copper Hollow, she hadn't planned on staying long. The bag felt almost empty, as if she'd brought only the bare necessities for a brief visit. "That's very kind." She studied his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if she were searching for something specific. "You look well, Mr. Carter. The years have been good to you." Before he could respond, the bag slipped from his grip. It hit the ground with a soft thud, and the clasp, apparently weakened by years of travel, gave way. Contents spilled across the dusty street, a few items of clothing, a small leather journal, and several folded papers that looked official in nature. "I'm sorry," Boone began, but Josie was already kneeling, frantically gathering the scattered belongings. As he bent to help, one of the papers caught his eye. Legal documents. From the look of them, with official seals and formal language. He caught a glimpse of words that made his chest tighten. Custody proceedings and minor child. Before Josie snatched the paper away. "Those are private," she said sharply, stuffing everything back into the bag with shaking hands. "Of course, I didn't mean, I know what you meant." Her tone softened slightly, but the wariness remained. "I'm sorry, it's been a long journey." Martha McKinnon stepped forward, her merchant's instincts overriding her curiosity. "Miss McGraw, you'll be needing a place to stay. The hotel's been closed since spring, but I'm sure we can arrange something suitable." Actually, Widow Morrison appeared as if summoned by the mention of propriety. "I have a spare room. It would be entirely appropriate for a young lady traveling alone." Josie looked from one woman to the other, then back to Boone. Something passed across her face, gratitude mixed with resignation, as if she'd accepted help she didn't really want. "That's very generous, Mrs. Morrison. I'd be happy to pay for room and board." "Nonsense. This is Copper Hollow. We take care of our own." The phrase hung in the air between them. Our own. Boone wondered if Josie felt the weight of those words, the way he did the assumption of belonging, the unspoken expectation that 16 years hadn't changed, the fundamental connections that bound people to places. As the crowd began to disperse, Boone found himself walking beside Josie toward Widow Morrison's house. She moved with a purpose he didn't remember from childhood, each step deliberate and measured. Gone was the bouncing energy of the little girl who had raced through town like a whirlwind. This woman carried herself like someone who had learned to be careful, to watch for threats that might emerge from unexpected directions. "The town looks smaller than I remembered," she said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "It is smaller. Railroad passed us by. People follow opportunity. But you stayed." It wasn't quite a question, but it demanded an answer anyway. "This is home." She nodded as if that explanation made perfect sense, though something in her expression suggested she no longer understood what home meant. They walked past the church, where she'd attended services as a child, past the schoolhouse where she'd learned to read, past the general store where her mother had bought supplies for their small household. "How long are you planning to stay?" The question slipped out before he could stop himself. Josie paused at the gate to Widow Morrison's house. "I'm not sure yet. There are some matters I need to resolve." The legal papers, the custody proceedings, whatever had brought her back to Copper Hollow wasn't sentiment or nostalgia, it was necessity, perhaps even desperation, if you need anything help with those matters. "Thank you." She cut him off gently but firmly. "I appreciate the offer, but this is something I need to handle myself." That night, Boone sat on his porch long after the sun had set, listening to the familiar sounds of evening settling over the valley. Somewhere across town, Josie McGraw was sleeping in Widow Morrison's spare room, carrying secrets that had driven her back to a place she'd left behind 16 years ago. The little girl who had promised to marry him when she grew up had returned as a woman, with troubles weighing on her shoulders and wariness in her eyes. Whatever those legal papers contained, whatever had put that careful distance in her manner, Boone knew with absolute certainty that his quiet, predictable life had just become infinitely more complicated. He pulled out his father's watch, its steady tick marking time in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring questions that needed answers, and he suspected that before this was over, both of their lives would be forever changed by whatever had brought Josie McGraw home to Copper Hollow. By Friday morning, Josie had established herself as the most intriguing mystery Copper Hollow had seen in years. She rose early, helped Widow Morrison with household chores, and spent her afternoons walking through town with the purposeful stride of someone conducting business. Yet what that business might be remained as elusive as morning mist. Boone first encountered her at the bank, where she stood at the counter discussing something in low, urgent tones with the clerk. Her posture suggested familiarity with financial matters, shoulders straight, hands gesturing with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. When she noticed him waiting behind her, she gathered her papers quickly and stepped aside. "Mr. Carter." She nodded politely, but he caught the way her fingers clutched the documents against her chest. "Miss McGraw, everything all right?" "Of course." The response came too quickly, too bright. "Just taking care of some old family business." He wanted to press, to offer help with whatever burden she carried, but the careful distance in her manner warned him away. Instead, he touched his hat brim and watched her leave, noting how she glanced over her shoulder before disappearing around the corner. That afternoon, he found her at Peterson's stable, running her hands along the flanks of a chestnut mare with the practiced touch of someone who understood horses. The sight surprised him. The Josie he remembered had been afraid of anything larger than a barn cat. "She's a beauty," he said, approaching slowly so as not to startle either woman or horse. Josie looked up, a genuine smile replacing her usual guarded expression. "Her conformation is excellent, good bloodlines, from the look of her." She patted the mare's neck. "Mr. Peterson says she's got a gentle temperament despite her size." "You know horses now." "I know a lot of things now." The words carried no boast, only the quiet confidence of someone who had been forced to learn quickly. Life has a way of teaching you skills you never expected to need. Peterson emerged from the tack room, wiping his hands on a leather apron. "Miss McGraw here's got a fine eye for horseflesh. Been asking about breeding lines and training methods. Most ladies just want to know if the animal looks pretty." Boone studied Josie's profile as she continued examining the mare. This wasn't the casual interest of someone making polite conversation. She was evaluating the horse with the thoroughness of a potential buyer, though what use she'd have for livestock remained unclear. "You thinking of staying long enough to need a horse?" Her hands stilled on the mare's mane. "I'm thinking about a lot of possibilities." Before he could pursue that cryptic response, young Pete Williams came trotting up the street, his face flushed with excitement. "Boss, there you are. Doc Henley says the Patterson baby's doing fine, and Mary wants to know if you'll be bringing anyone to the church social next week." Pete's eyes found Josie, and his expression shifted to something approaching awe. Boone suppressed a smile. The boy had always been susceptible to pretty faces, though his heart belonged firmly to Mary Collins. "Pete Williams," Boone said by way of introduction, "works my ranch. Pete, this is Miss Josie McGraw. Pleased to meet you, Miss McGraw." Pete swept off his hat with exaggerated gallantry. "Welcome back to Copper Hollow." "Thank you, Mr. Williams. You work cattle?" "Yes, ma'am. Been with Mr. Carter 3 years now. Best rancher in the valley, if you ask me." Pete's chest puffed with pride. "Course, he works too hard. Could use someone to remind him there's more to life than cattle and fences." Boone felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Pete, it's all right," Josie said, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Mr. Williams is just being protective of his employer. That's admirable. Doe, he could use some protection," Pete continued, oblivious to Boone's warning glare. "Man his age shouldn't be rattling around that big house alone. Needs a wife to make it feel like home." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Josie's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were considering something Pete couldn't possibly understand. Boone wanted to drag his ranch hand away before the boy could embarrass them both further. "I should get back to town," Josie said finally. "Mrs. Morrison is expecting me for dinner." As she walked away, Pete let out a low whistle. "Boss, that's the prettiest woman I've seen since well ever, and she knows horses. Mary's always saying, you need someone who understands ranch life." "Pete, I'm just saying, a woman like that doesn't come along every day, especially not in Copper Hollow." That evening, Boone found himself taking a longer route home, one that happened to pass by Widow Morrison's house. Light glowed warm and yellow in the kitchen window, and he could see 2 figures moving about inside the widow and her guest, sharing the kind of comfortable domestic routine that made his own empty house feel even larger. He was still watching when the front door opened and Josie stepped onto the porch. She wore a simple grey dress that he hadn't seen before, and her hair was loose around her shoulders instead of pinned up in the severe style she'd favored since her arrival. For a moment, she looked younger, more like the girl he remembered. "Mr. Carter?" She'd spotted him despite the growing darkness. "Is everything all right?" Caught, staring like a schoolboy, Boone urged his horse closer to the fence. "Just heading home. Wanted to make sure you were settling in comfortably." "Mrs. Morrison has been very kind." Josie moved to the porch railing, close enough that he could see the wariness had returned to her eyes. "This is a good town. I'd forgotten how people here take care of each other. Most places aren't like Copper Hollow." "No, they're not." Something in her tone suggested she'd learned that lesson the hard way. In the city, people mind their own business. Sometimes that's a blessing. Sometimes it's a curse. Before he could ask what she meant, she moved back toward the door. "Good night, Mr. Carter. Thank you for checking on me. Josie." She paused, her hand on the door handle. "If you need anything, anything at all, you know where to find me." For a long moment, she stood silhouetted against the warm light from inside the house. When she spoke, her voice was so soft, he almost missed the words. "Be careful what you offer, Boone Carter. I might just take you up on it." The door closed behind her with a gentle click, leaving him alone in the darkness, with questions that multiplied like stars appearing in the evening sky. Whatever had brought Josie McGraw back to Copper Hollow, whatever secrets she carried in that worn leather bag, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The quiet, predictable life he'd built was about to be turned upside down. He rode home through the familiar darkness, his father's pocket watch ticking steadily in his vest pocket, marking time toward an uncertain future that suddenly seemed full of dangerous possibilities. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Boone had been dreading his birthday celebration all week, but as he dressed in his best shirt and jacket, he found himself thinking less about unwanted attention and more about whether Josie would attend. Widow Morrison had made it clear that her houseguest was expected at the church hall, though Josie herself had remained non-committal when the subject arose. Boone told himself it didn't matter, the woman had her own concerns. And a 45-year-old rancher's birthday party was hardly the kind of social event that would interest someone who'd clearly seen more of the world than Copper Hollow could offer. Still, he found himself taking extra care with his appearance, even going so far as to trim his beard and polish his boots until they gleamed. The church hall buzzed with activity when he arrived. Martha McKinnon had outdone herself with decorations, lanterns strung between the rafters, wildflowers in mason jars on every table, and enough food to feed twice the town's population. Half of Copper Hollow had turned out, along with a surprising number of folks from neighboring settlements who'd made the journey for the occasion. "There's the birthday boy." Doc Henley clapped him on the shoulder with enough force to rattle his teeth. 45 years and still standing. That's something to celebrate. Boone accepted congratulations and well wishes with as much grace as he could muster, all the while scanning the crowd for a familiar auburn head. Pete Williams appeared at his elbow, grinning like he'd discovered gold in the creek bed. "Boss, you clean up real nice. Mary says you look like a proper gentleman when you put your mind to it." "Where is Mary?" Boone looked around for Pete's sweetheart, grateful for any distraction from his own self-consciousness. "Helping in the kitchen. Says the womenfolk have everything under control." Pete's grin widened. "Also says Miss McGraw asked specifically about when you'd be arriving." Before Boone could process that information, a hush fell over the room. He turned toward the entrance and felt his breath catch in his throat. Josie stood in the doorway, wearing a dress of deep emerald green that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck, and she carried herself with the poise of someone comfortable in formal settings. But it was the small, hesitant smile on her lips that made his heart skip. She moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, accepting introductions and greetings from people who remembered her as a child. Boone watched her navigate conversations with the skill of someone accustomed to social situations far more complex than anything Copper Hollow could provide. "Miss McGraw," he said when she finally reached him. "You look—" He stopped, suddenly aware that half the room was listening. "You look lovely." "Thank you." A flush colored her cheeks. "Mrs. Morrison insisted I couldn't miss your celebration. She said the whole town would consider it a snub. And we couldn't have that." "No," she agreed solemnly. "That would be terrible for my reputation." The slight teasing in her tone reminded him of the spirited little girl who had once challenged him to foot races behind the church. Before he could respond, Reverend Collins called for attention. "Friends, we're gathered tonight to celebrate one of our own. Boone Carter has been a pillar of this community for as long as most of us can remember. In good times and bad, he's been someone we could count on." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Boone felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but when he glanced at Josie, he found her watching him with something that looked like admiration. "Now, I know Boone's not much for speeches," the Reverend continued, "so we won't torture him with one. But I will say this, a man is measured not just by what he accomplishes, but by how he treats others along the way. By that measure, Boone Carter is rich indeed." The applause that followed was warm and genuine. Boone nodded his thanks, then found himself caught in a receiving line of well-wishers. Through it all, he remained aware of Josie's presence, the way she seemed to observe everything with keen interest. When the formal congratulations ended and the fiddle music began, he worked up the courage to approach her. She stood near the refreshment table, talking quietly with Martha McKinnon about something that had them both laughing. "Miss McGraw," he said, offering his arm, "would you care to dance?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Aye, yes, that would be nice." The fiddle played a gentle waltz, and Boone was grateful for the countless hours his mother had insisted he spend learning proper dancing. Josie moved in his arms with natural grace, following his lead as if they'd danced together countless times before. "You're full of surprises," she said as they swayed to the music. "I wouldn't have expected a rancher to be so accomplished on the dance floor." "My mother insisted. Said a gentleman should know how to conduct himself in polite society. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. The familiar pang of loss hit him, but it felt softer somehow with Josie in his arms. She would have liked you. Would have remembered that little girl who used to follow me around like a devoted puppy. Josie stumbled slightly, and he tightened his grip to steady her. I was not a puppy. No. Then what would you call it? Hero worship, she said after a moment. You were the biggest, strongest man I'd ever seen. To an 8-year-old girl, you seemed capable of anything. And now? She looked up at him, her green eyes serious. Now I know that being big and strong doesn't solve everything. Sometimes the problems are too complicated for simple solutions. The music ended, but they remained close for a heartbeat longer than strictly proper. Around them, other couples were changing partners or leaving the floor, but Boone felt as if they existed in their own small universe. Josie, he began, then stopped. The questions he wanted to ask about those legal papers, about what had brought her back, about whether she planned to stay, seemed too large for this moment. I should probably help clean up, she said, stepping back with visible reluctance. Of course. As she moved away, Pete appeared at his side, wearing the same knowing grin that had been plastering his face all evening. Boss, if you don't ask that woman to marry you soon, someone else is going to snatch her up. Mark my words. Boone watched Josie stack plates with efficient movements, her emerald dress catching the lantern light. For just a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what Pete suggested, a future where Josie McGraw stayed in Copper Hollow, where that big, empty house became a home filled with laughter and conversation. Then reality reasserted itself. Whatever had brought her back was temporary. Women like Josie, educated, worldly, carrying secrets that required legal documents, didn't settle for small-town ranches, no matter how strong their childhood affections might have been. Still, as he helped extinguish the lanterns and fold the tables, Boone couldn't shake the memory of how perfectly she'd fit in his arms, or the way she'd looked at him during that brief, electric moment when the music stopped and the rest of the world seemed to disappear. The following Tuesday morning brought an unexpected invitation. Boone was checking fence posts in the south pasture when Pete came riding up, his horse lathered from a hard gallop. Boss, message from Widow Morrison. She's asking if you'd escort Miss McGraw around the ranch today. Says the lady's curious about cattle operations. Boone straightened slowly, trying to keep his expression neutral despite the way his pulse quickened. She say why? Nope. Just that Miss McGraw mentioned an interest in seeing how a proper ranch works. Pete's grin suggested he found the whole situation highly entertaining. Told her you'd be honored to show her around. You told her what? Well, wouldn't you be? Prettiest woman in 3 counties wants to spend the day with you, and you're worried about saying the wrong thing. Pete shook his head in exaggerated dismay. Boss, sometimes I wonder how you've survived this long without someone to manage your social life. An hour later, Boone found himself riding toward town in his cleanest work clothes, trying to ignore the way his stomach churned with nervous energy. He'd shown plenty of visitors around the ranch over the years, potential buyers, neighboring ranchers, even a few government men interested in breeding programs. But none of those encounters had made him second-guess every word before it left his mouth. Josie was waiting on Widow Morrison's front porch, dressed in a practical riding skirt and boots that looked well used. She'd traded her usual elegant hairstyle for a simple braid that hung over one shoulder, and the effect made her look younger, more approachable. "Mr. Carter," she called as he approached, "I hope I'm not imposing on your work schedule." "Not at all." He dismounted and touched his hat brim. "Though I should warn you, ranch work isn't particularly exciting for most folks." "I'm not most folks." The simple statement carried weight, as if she were reminding him of something important. "Mrs. Morrison mentioned you might have a horse I could borrow." "Already arranged. Peterson's lending us his gentlest mare." As they rode toward the ranch, Josie proved to be an accomplished horsewoman, sitting her mount with the relaxed confidence of someone comfortable in the saddle. She asked intelligent questions about the land, the cattle, the challenges of running a successful operation in an increasingly difficult economy. "Your father built all this?" she asked, as they crested the hill that offered the best view of the rocking sea spread. Started with a quarter section and built up over 30 years. He had dreams of something grand, a dynasty that would last generations. And now? Boone studied the familiar landscape, rolling pastures dotted with cattle, the creek winding silver through cottonwoods, the solid buildings his father had constructed to last. Now it's just me, trying to keep his dream alive. Something in his tone must have conveyed more than he intended, because Josie's expression softened. That's a heavy burden for one man to carry. It's what family does. We honor the sacrifices of those who came before. They rode in comfortable silence toward the main house, a structure that always made Boone simultaneously proud and melancholy. His father had designed it with optimism, wide porches for summer evenings, filled with children's laughter, a dining room large enough for holiday gatherings, bedrooms that would house sons and daughters, and eventually grandchildren. "It's beautiful," Josie said as they dismounted near the front steps. "Your father must have been quite a dreamer." He was. Mother used to tease him about building a mansion in the middle of nowhere, but he insisted that if you're going to dream, you might as well dream big. Inside, the house felt even more cavernous than usual, with a visitor present. Boone found himself seeing it through Josie's eyes, the formal parlor that no one ever used, the dining room with its long table set for guests who never came, the family portraits lining the hallway like sentinels guarding memories. In his mother's former sitting room, Josie paused before a small mahogany table that held his mother's music box. The delicate piece had been a wedding gift from his father, carved with roses and fitted with a mechanism that played a gentle waltz. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the box. Boone nodded, though something twisted in his chest as she lifted the lid. The familiar melody filled the room, sweet and sad, just as it had when his mother used to play it during her evening routines. Hidden beneath the velvet lining, exactly where his mother had placed it 20 years ago, lay her wedding ring. The simple gold band caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Josie stared at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She never took it off, Boone found himself saying. Even after she got sick, even when her hands swelled so badly that Doc Henley had to cut other rings away. This one she insisted on keeping. "True love doesn't end with death," Josie said softly. "It just changes form." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither seemed ready to explore. Boone reached past her to close the music box, his arm brushing against hers in the confined space. For a moment, they stood close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she favored, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Boone," she said, and his name on her lips sounded different, somehow softer, more intimate than the formal address she'd maintained since her return. "Yes, thank you for showing me this, for trusting me with something so personal." He wanted to tell her that trust came easily where she was concerned, that something about her presence made the empty rooms feel warm again. Instead, he stepped back, putting safer distance between them. "We should check on the cattle. The afternoon's getting away from us." The rest of the tour proceeded smoothly, with Josie asking knowledgeable questions about breeding programs and market prices. But Boone remained aware of something fundamental that had shifted in his mother's sitting room, a recognition that the careful boundaries they'd maintained were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. As they rode back toward town in the fading light, Josie was unusually quiet. When they reached Widow Morrison's house, she dismounted with the same grace she'd shown all day, but her expression was troubled. "Boone," she said as he prepared to leave, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about why I came back." His heart hammered against his ribs. "All right." She looked toward the house, where lamplight glowed warm in the windows, then back at him. "Not here. Not tonight. But soon. You deserve to know the truth. Whatever it is, Josie." "Don't." She held up a hand, stopping his reassurance before he could offer it. "Don't make promises until you know what you're promising. Some truths change everything." With that cryptic warning, she disappeared into the house, leaving Boone alone in the gathering darkness, with the certainty that whatever she needed to tell him would transform both their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of restless energy that made horses skittish and children fretful. Boone had spent the day trying to focus on routine tasks, but his mind kept returning to Josie's promise to tell him the truth. Whatever secret she carried had put shadows under her eyes and tension in her shoulders that no amount of Widow Morrison's mothering could ease. He was mending tack in the barn when Pete burst through the doors, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked like alarm. "Boss, you need to come to town, right now." Boone set down his leather punch. "What's wrong?" "Miss McGraw, she's at Doc Henley's office and she's well, she's crying. Widow Morrison sent me to fetch you." The ride to town felt endless, despite the hard pace Boone set. He found a small crowd gathered outside Doc Henley's office: Martha McKinnon, Reverend Collins, and several other concerned neighbors who'd been drawn by whatever crisis had unfolded. Inside, he discovered Josie sitting in one of the doctor's chairs, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a telegram in her trembling hands. Widow Morrison sat beside her, one protective arm around her shoulders, while Doc Henley hovered nearby with the helpless expression of a man who specialized in fixing bodies, not broken hearts. "What happened?" Boone asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Josie looked up at him, and the anguish in her eyes made his chest tighten. "Emma's sick, very sick. The fever won't break, and she's asking for me. Emma, my—" She stopped, pressing her lips together as if the words were too difficult to speak. "She's 6 years old, the most important person in my world, and I can't get to her." Widow Morrison's expression grew fierce. "Tell him, child. Tell him everything. This burden is too heavy for you to carry alone." Josie stared at the telegram, her shoulders shaking with the effort to control her emotions. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Emma is my sister's daughter. Sarah died 2 years ago in a factory accident in Chicago, and Emma came to live with me. But when Sarah's husband, Emma's stepfather, found out about the inheritance Sarah left, he went to court, claimed I was unfit to raise a child because I'm unmarried and work for wages. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place: the legal documents, the careful way she'd avoided questions about her past, the skills and education that spoke of a life lived in larger, more demanding circumstances than Copper Hollow could provide. He won Emma in court," she continued, "but I couldn't. I wouldn't let him have her. Marcus drinks, and he has a temper that gets worse when he's been drinking. Emma was terrified of him, and I'd seen the bruises." Doc Henley made a sound of disgust. "Bruises?" "Small ones. On her arms where he'd grabbed her too hard. She tried to hide them, but children aren't good at deception." Josie's voice grew stronger, fueled by anger. "So I took her, stole her, according to the law. We ran." "Where is she now?" Boone asked, though he dreaded the answer. "With friends in Denver. Good people who've been hiding us both, but they can't keep her much longer. Marcus has hired men to look for us, and every day we stay puts them in danger." She held up the telegram. "Now she's sick, and I can't go to her because if I'm seen in Denver, they'll take her away from me forever." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Doc Henley's mantel clock. Boone studied Josie's face, the tear tracks, the exhaustion, the desperate love of a woman fighting for a child's safety. Everything about her behavior since returning to Copper Hollow suddenly made sense. "How sick?" Doc Henley asked, his professional instincts overriding the social drama. "High fever for 3 days. Not eating. The telegram says she keeps asking when I'm coming home." Fresh tears spilled down Josie's cheeks. She doesn't understand why I left her. "Children's fevers can break quickly," the doctor said gently. "What matters is that she's being cared for by people who love her." "But I should be there." Josie's voice cracked. "I promised Sarah I'd take care of her baby, and instead I'm hiding in a town 300 miles away while Emma suffers." Boone found himself moving without conscious thought, kneeling beside her chair and covering her hands with his own. "We'll figure this out." "We?" The word came out small and uncertain. "You're not alone in this." He looked around the room, taking in the concerned faces of people who'd known him all his life. "This whole town will help if you'll let us." Widow Morrison nodded firmly. "Boone's right, dear. We take care of our own." "But I'm not. I only came back because—" Josie struggled with the words. "Because you needed sanctuary," Boone finished. "Because you remembered that Copper Hollow protects the people it claims as family." Martha McKinnon stepped forward. "What do you need, child? Money? Supplies? Someone to accompany you to Denver?" "I can't go to Denver. If Marcus's men see me." "Then we'll bring Emma here," Boone said, the solution crystallizing in his mind with startling clarity. "I'll go to Denver, fetch her and bring her back where she'll be safe. You don't understand. Marcus has legal custody. If you're caught helping me, let me worry about that." Boone's voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. "What matters is getting that little girl the care she needs." Josie stared at him, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. "You'd do that? For a child you've never met?" "I'd do it for you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went far beyond the immediate crisis. Around them, the townspeople exchanged glances that spoke of understanding and approval. "There's more," Josie said finally. "The reason Marcus wants Emma isn't just about the inheritance, it's about control. He's the kind of man who can't bear to lose anything he considers his property. Even if you bring Emma here, he'll follow. He'll bring those hired men, and he won't stop until he gets what he wants. Then we'll be ready for him." Widow Morrison said with steel in her voice. "This town has faced down cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, and all manner of unpleasant men. One more won't make much difference." Doc Henley cleared his throat. "There might be a legal solution. If Josie were married to a man of good standing in the community, a man with property and reputation, that could change the custody situation considerably." The suggestion settled over the room like morning mist. Boone felt Josie's hands tense under his, felt the weight of every gaze in the room. That's very practical," she said carefully, "but marriage should be about more than legal convenience." "Should be," Boone agreed, "but sometimes practical solutions can grow into something deeper, given time and patience." Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, Boone saw past her walls to the frightened woman beneath. She wasn't just protecting Emma, she was protecting her own heart, guarding against the possibility of loss and disappointment that seemed to follow her like shadows. "Think about it," he said softly. "Whatever you decide, we'll face it together." The journey to Denver took 2 days of hard riding, with Boone pushing the pace despite Josie's obvious exhaustion. She'd insisted on coming despite the risks, and he'd learned quickly that arguing with her about Emma's welfare was futile. The child's fever had broken, according to the latest telegram, but Josie wouldn't rest until she held her niece in her own arms. They reached the outskirts of Denver as evening shadows stretched long across the prairie. The safe house turned out to be a modest boarding establishment run by a middle-aged German couple, Hans and Greta Zimmermann, who greeted Josie with the fierce protectiveness of surrogate parents. "She asks for you every hour," Greta said, leading them up a narrow staircase. "Such a brave little thing, but she cries when she thinks no one is watching." The door opened to reveal a small, dimly lit room where a child lay sleeping in a narrow bed. Even in the fading light, Boone could see the family resemblance, the same auburn hair as Josie, the same delicate bone structure. Emma appeared fragile as spun glass, her small face pale against the white pillowcase. Josie moved to the bedside with the desperate urgency of a woman who'd been holding her breath for days. "Emma, sweetheart, Aunt Josie's here." The child's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening with recognition and joy. "Aunt Josie, you came back!" "Of course I came back. I promised I would, didn't I?" Emma struggled to sit up, her thin arms reaching for her aunt. As Josie gathered the child close, Boone noticed something that made his chest tighten. A faded rag doll clutched in Emma's small fist, its button eyes and embroidered smile worn smooth by countless hours of comfort. "I kept Molly safe for you," Emma whispered into Josie's shoulder. "Even when I was scared, I kept her safe like you told me. You did perfectly, sweetheart. You're such a brave girl." Over Emma's head, Josie's eyes met Boone's, and he saw the depth of love that had driven her desperate flight across 3 states. This wasn't just about family obligation. This child was her heart, walking around outside her body. "Emma," Josie said gently, "I want you to meet someone very special. This is Mr. Carter. He's the man I told you about from when I was little." Emma turned in her aunt's arms to study Boone with the unabashed curiosity of childhood. "The giant cowboy from the stories? That's right. You're even bigger than I imagined." Emma's voice held wonder rather than fear. "Aunt Josie said you were the strongest, kindest man in the whole world." Heat flooded Boone's cheeks. "Your aunt was very generous with her descriptions. She said when she was little, she promised to marry you someday. Are you going to marry her now?" The innocent question hung in the air like a challenge. Boone glanced at Josie, whose face had turned the color of ripe apples. "Emma," she said quickly, "that's not something—" "I hope so," Boone said quietly, "if she'll have me." Before anyone could respond to that declaration, Hans Zimmerman appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Josie, you need to come downstairs. Now, there are men asking questions at the hotel across the street." The safe cocoon of reunion shattered instantly. Josie's arms tightened around Emma as fear replaced joy in her eyes. "How many men?" Boone asked, already moving toward the window. 3, well-dressed, carrying themselves like they know how to handle trouble. They're showing papers to anyone who'll look. Boone peered through the curtains at the hotel across the street. Sure enough, 3 men in dark suits stood in the lobby, one of them speaking animatedly to the desk clerk. Even from this distance, he could see they weren't local law enforcement. They moved with the calculated efficiency of hired professionals. "We need to leave," Josie said, already reaching for their travel bags. "Now, before—" "Too late." Hans's voice was tight with worry. "They're coming this way." Emma whimpered and pressed closer to her aunt, the rag doll forgotten as she sensed the adult's fear. Boone's mind raced through possibilities, tactics learned during years, when such thinking had meant the difference between life and death. "Is there a back way out?" he asked. "Yes, but it leads into an alley." "If they're watching—" "They are." Boone had caught sight of a 4th man positioned across the rear exit. "Hans, how well do you know these men? Are they the type to respect property laws, or—" His question was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Through the thin walls, they heard Greta's voice, high and nervous, claiming to know nothing about any young woman and child. "Mr. Carter," Emma whispered, her small hand finding his. "I'm scared." Something shifted inside Boone's chest, a protective instinct so fierce it surprised him with its intensity. He knelt beside the bed, bringing himself to Emma's eye level. "Listen to me, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to do things that seem scary, but I promise you're going to be safe. Do you trust me?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Good. We're going to play a game where we have to be very quiet and very brave. Can you do that?" Another nod, this one more confident. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Boone heard Greta's voice crack as she continued to deny knowledge of their presence. "Josie," he said quietly, "I need you to listen carefully. Take Emma and wait by the back window. When I give the signal, you climb down and head for the livery stable 3 blocks east. There's a man there named Patterson. Tell him Boone Carter sent you, and he'll get you horses." "What about you? I'll be right behind you." The lie came easily, born of necessity and the certain knowledge that someone needed to buy them time to escape. "Boone, I won't leave you." "Yes, you will." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. "Because Emma needs you more than I do, and you know it." Before she could argue further, they heard the front door splinter. Heavy footsteps echoed through the boarding house, followed by Hans's angry protests and Greta's frightened cries. "Go!" Boone commanded. "Now!" As Josie gathered Emma and moved toward the window, Boone positioned himself by the bedroom door. The footsteps were on the stairs now, methodical and purposeful. He thought of his father's pocket watch, ticking steadily in his vest pocket, marking what might be his final moments. Then the door burst open, and everything changed. The first man through was broad-shouldered and professional, his hand resting casually on the grip of a holstered pistol. Behind him came two others, equally well-armed and dangerous. But it was their leader who commanded Boone's attention, a man whose bearing and movements spoke of military training. "Well, well," the leader said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Boone Carter, if I'm not mistaken. Former Captain Carter of the 5th Colorado Cavalry." The recognition hit Boone like a physical blow. These weren't just hired thugs, they were professionals who'd done their research. Worse, they knew about his past, the part of his life he'd buried along with too many good men on too many blood-soaked battlefields. "You have the advantage," Boone said carefully. "Indeed I do. My name is Colonel Marcus Whitfield, and I believe you have something that belongs to me. I don't think we've ever met, Colonel." "No, but we share an interesting connection. You see, your military record makes for fascinating reading. 23 major engagements, including that unpleasant business at Cedar Creek. Quite the war hero, weren't you?" Boone's blood turned to ice. Cedar Creek, the battle that still visited him in nightmares, where he'd lost his entire unit to a Confederate ambush that shouldn't have happened, where his tactical decisions had led good men to their deaths. That was a long time ago. "Indeed, but skills like yours don't simply disappear, do they? Which is why I'm hoping we can resolve this situation like civilized men." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're going to return my stepdaughter to me, Captain Carter, and then you're going to forget you ever met Josie McGraw." Through the back window, Boone caught a glimpse of movement, Josie and Emma reaching the alley safely. Relief flooded through him, even as the implications of Marcus's knowledge settled like stones in his stomach. "The girl isn't here," he said truthfully. "No? Then where is she?" Before Boone could answer, Emma's high, clear voice drifted up from the alley below. "Aunt Josie, I dropped Molly." Marcus's smile widened. "How careless of me. It seems she is here after all." In that moment, Boone understood that everything he'd thought he knew about this situation was wrong. Marcus wasn't just some abusive stepfather with a legal claim. He was a trained soldier with resources and connections that made him infinitely more dangerous than a simple family custody dispute. "Let them go," Boone said quietly. "Your fight is with me now." "Oh, Captain Carter, my fight has always been with you. You just didn't know it yet." The standoff in the cramped boarding house room stretched taut as a bowstring. Marcus Whitfield studied Boone with the calculating gaze of a predator, assessing prey, while his men positioned themselves to block any escape route. Outside, Emma's voice had fallen silent, which meant Josie had managed to quiet the child, a small mercy in an increasingly dangerous situation. "You seem surprised, Captain Carter," Marcus said, settling into the room's single chair with the casual confidence of a man holding all the advantages. "Did you really think your war record was buried so deeply that no one would ever uncover it?" "What do you want?" Boone kept his voice level, his hands visible and still. Years of command had taught him to show no weakness when outnumbered. "Justice." The word dripped with venom. "You see, I lost everything at Cedar Creek. My command, my men, my reputation, all because of your tactical brilliance." The pieces of a puzzle Boone had never wanted to solve began falling into place. Cedar Creek had been a bloodbath that haunted him still, but he'd never known the full extent of casualties on the Confederate side. Apparently, Colonel Marcus Whitfield had been among the survivors, nursing grudges that time had sharpened rather than dulled. "The war ended 20 years ago," Boone said quietly. "For you, perhaps. For me, it ended the day I found my brother's body in that ravine where your cavalry charge drove our reserves. Marcus's composure cracked slightly, revealing the raw fury beneath. Thomas was 17 years old, Captain, barely old enough to shave, and you cut him down like wheat before a scythe. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Boone remembered that charge, remembered the chaos and terror of men and horses screaming in the narrow confines of the ravine. He'd led it personally, knowing that hesitation would cost Union lives. Young Confederate soldiers had died that day, but so had boys in blue uniforms who trusted him to bring them home. "I'm sorry for your loss," Boone said, meaning it. "But that doesn't give you the right to terrorize a child, doesn't it?" Marcus leaned forward, his eyes glittering with malice. "When I discovered that the famous Josie McGraw, the woman who stole my stepdaughter, had connections to the infamous Boone Carter, I saw the hand of Providence. Finally a chance to balance the scales. Emma isn't part of this. She's an innocent child." "So was my brother." Marcus stood, pacing to the window, where he could watch the alley below. "But innocence provides no protection in war, as you well know. The child is merely leverage." Through the thin walls, Boone could hear Hans and Greta Zimmerman being questioned by Marcus's men. The elderly couple's frightened voices made his jaw clench with suppressed rage. Whatever sins he carried from Cedar Creek, they didn't deserve to suffer for them. "What do you propose?" Boone asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Simple. You surrender yourself to me, and I let the woman and child disappear. They can run to California, to Mexico, to the ends of the earth for all I care. But you'll answer for what you did to my family. And if I refuse?" Marcus's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then I exercise my legal rights as Emma's guardian. The child comes with me, and Miss McGraw can spend the rest of her life wondering what became of her precious niece." The choice was no choice at all, and they both knew it. Boone had seen enough of Marcus's type during the war, men who would sacrifice anything and anyone to satisfy their need for vengeance. Emma would become a weapon in his hands, a way to punish Josie for the crime of loving a child more than her own safety. "I need guarantees," Boone said finally. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate terms." "Aren't I?" Boone stepped closer to the window, close enough that Marcus's men tensed. "That woman down there knows every detail of your illegal activities. The forged custody documents, the hired guns, the threats against civilians. One telegram to the right federal marshal, and your little vendetta becomes a federal case." It was a bluff, but Marcus's slight flinch suggested it had hit home. Whatever methods he'd used to track them down probably wouldn't bear close legal scrutiny. "What do you want?" Marcus asked grudgingly. "Safe passage back to Copper Hollow for both of them. A week to settle their affairs and say goodbye." "Impossible. I won't risk them disappearing again." "Then you get nothing." Boone moved toward the door with deliberate calm. "I'd rather take my chances fighting your men than hand myself over for no guarantee of their safety." "Wait." The word cracked like a whip. Marcus studied him with renewed interest, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You'd really sacrifice yourself for them? A woman you barely know and a child you met an hour ago?" "Yes." The simple answer seemed to puzzle Marcus, as if genuine selflessness was a concept beyond his understanding. He resumed his pacing, his mind clearly working through possibilities and complications. "Very well. Safe passage to Copper Hollow, and 3 days to arrange their affairs. But understand this, Captain, if they attempt to run, if they contact any federal authorities, if they do anything other than comply with my terms, I'll hunt them down and make them both pay for your sins. 3 days isn't enough to... 3 days. Take it or watch them suffer the consequences of your refusal." Before Boone could respond, a commotion erupted in the alley below. Emma's frightened cry pierced the evening air, followed by Josie's sharp command to leave the child alone. Marcus moved to the window, his expression shifting from satisfaction to concern. "It seems your women have encountered my rear guard," he said, signaling to one of his men. Perhaps we should conclude this negotiation downstairs. The next few minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Marcus's men escorted them to the alley where Josie stood, with Emma pressed against her skirts, both of them surrounded by 3 more armed men. The child's rag doll lay trampled in the dirt, its cheerful face smudged with mud. "Aunt Josie!" Emma broke free and ran to Boone, wrapping her thin arms around his legs with desperate trust. "They hurt Molly." Boone knelt to retrieve the doll, gently brushing dirt from its worn fabric. "Sometimes toys get dirty, sweetheart, but they can be cleaned and made good as new." "Really? Really?" He handed the doll back to her, then looked up at Josie. Her face was pale but composed, though he could see the fear she was fighting to hide. "Are you hurt?" "No, but they—" She stopped, glancing at Emma. "They made their intentions clear." Marcus approached with the satisfied air of a man who held all the winning cards. "Miss McGraw, how lovely to see you again. You've led me quite a chase." "Marcus," Josie's voice dripped with loathing, "I should have known you'd eventually crawl out from whatever rock you've been hiding under. Such harsh words from a woman who stole my stepdaughter and ran away like a common criminal. I protected her from a man who saw her as property rather than a human being. Touching, but misguided." Marcus gestured to his men, who moved to flank Josie and Emma. "Fortunately, Captain Carter and I have reached an understanding. You and the child will return to Copper Hollow under escort, where you'll have 3 days to prepare for your permanent separation." "What?" Josie's composure cracked. "Boone, what did you agree to?" "What I had to," he said simply. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by fury. "No, absolutely not. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for us. It's not your choice to make." "The hell it isn't." The profanity, so unlike her usual careful speech, made Emma look up in surprise. Josie immediately softened her tone. "Emma, sweetheart, could you pet the horses while the grown-ups talk?" As the child moved toward the animals, carefully clutching her rescued doll, Josie stepped closer to Boone. "There has to be another way. If there is, I can't see it." "Then we'll find one, together." Her hand found his arm, her grip fierce with desperation. "Boone Carter, you listen to me. I didn't spend 16 years growing into the woman who could make that childhood promise come true, just to lose you to some madman's revenge." The declaration hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Before Boone could respond, Marcus cleared his throat impatiently. "How touching, but I'm afraid your romantic reunion will have to wait. We have a schedule to keep." As Marcus's men began organizing the journey back to Copper Hollow, Boone found himself studying Emma, who had become fascinated by one of the horses, despite her ordeal. The child's resilience amazed him. She'd been sick, frightened, and separated from the only family she knew, yet she still found wonder in simple things, like a gentle mare's soft nose. "She's remarkable," he said to Josie. "She's everything good that Sarah left behind." Josie's voice broke slightly. "I can't lose her, Boone, but I can't lose you either. You won't lose either of us." The promise came from somewhere deeper than logic, or planning a place where hope lived despite overwhelming odds. "We'll find a way." As they prepared to leave Denver, Boone pulled out his father's pocket watch. The familiar weight felt heavier somehow, as if it carried not just the passage of time, but the weight of generations. His grandfather had survived a war. His father had built a legacy from nothing. Perhaps, with enough courage and the support of good people, Boone Carter could find a way to protect the family he'd never expected to claim as his own. 3 days. It would have to be enough. The morning of the 3rd day dawned crisp and clear over Copper Hollow, with the kind of golden light that made everything look blessed. Josie stood before the mirror in Widow Morrison's spare room, fastening her mother's pearl necklace with trembling fingers. The lustrous beads had belonged to 3 generations of women before her, each one wearing them on their wedding day as a symbol of family continuity and hope for the future. Today, those hopes felt as fragile as spun glass. "You look beautiful, dear," Widow Morrison said from the doorway, her voice thick with emotion. Your mother would be so proud. Would she? Josie's reflection stared back at her, pale but determined. I'm marrying a man to save a child from another man's vengeance. Mother believed marriage should be about love. And who's to say it isn't? The older woman moved into the room, her weathered hands gentle as she adjusted the necklace's clasp. I've seen the way you and Boone look at each other. Some love grows slowly, like good wine aging in the cellar. Through the window, Josie could see the church where half the town was already gathering. Sheriff Hayes stood near the entrance, his hand resting on his gun belt in a way that suggested he expected trouble. Marcus's men had made no secret of their presence in Copper Hollow, taking rooms at the abandoned hotel and watching the streets with the patience of hunters waiting for prey to emerge. Mrs. Morrison, Josie said quietly, if something goes wrong today, if Marcus doesn't honor his agreement, promise me you'll get Emma away from here. Child, nothing's going to go wrong. This town has faced down worse than one bitter man and his hired guns. But Josie had seen the calculation in Marcus's eyes, the way he studied every escape route and counted every potential ally. He wasn't just here for Emma, he was here to finish something that had started 20 years ago on a blood-soaked battlefield. The marriage ceremony was merely a complication in his larger plan. Downstairs, Emma sat at the kitchen table, carefully braiding ribbons into her rag doll's yarn hair. The child had shown remarkable resilience over the past 3 days, adapting to the strange situation with the flexibility of youth. But Josie could see the worry lurking behind her bright smiles, the way she clung to Molly whenever the adults' voices grew tense. Is Mr. Boone really going to be my uncle after today? Emma asked, looking up from her careful work. He's going to be your... Josie stopped, the complexity of their situation defying simple explanation. He's going to be family, the kind of family that chooses to love you, not just the kind you're born with. Good. Emma nodded with the satisfaction of a problem solved. I like him. He makes you smile the way Mama used to when she looked at my daddy. The innocent observation hit Josie like a physical blow. Sarah had indeed smiled that way when she looked at Emma's father before consumption took him when Emma was barely 2 years old. Before desperation drove Sarah to marry Marcus Whitfield, thinking any father was better than none. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Doc Henley appeared in the doorway, his medical bag in one hand and a small wrapped package in the other. Ladies, he said formally, I've come to escort the bride to her wedding. Is everything ready? Josie asked, accepting the package with curious fingers. As ready as we can make it. Boone's already at the church, looking like a man facing his own execution. Pete Williams is standing up with him, grinning like he's personally responsible for this match. Josie unwrapped the package to reveal a simple bouquet of wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, lupine, and prairie roses gathered from the meadows around town. Their colors blazed like jewels against the white tissue paper. From Boone, Doc Henley explained. He picked them himself this morning, said every bride deserves flowers on her wedding day. The gesture was so unexpected, so sweetly thoughtful, that Josie felt tears prick her eyes. In all the practical discussions of legal protection and strategic advantages, she'd almost forgotten that somewhere beneath the necessity lay the tender shoots of genuine affection. Time to go, sweetheart, she said to Emma, who scrambled down from her chair with Molly clutched tight in her arms. The walk to the church felt both endless and impossibly brief. Townspeople lined the street, their faces showing mixtures of joy, concern, and determination. Martha McKinnon waved from her store window. Peterson tipped his hat from the livery stable doorway. Even the children had been scrubbed and dressed in their finest clothes, as if the entire community was determined to make this wedding a celebration, despite the circumstances. But it was the sight of Marcus Whitfield standing in the church's shadow that made Josie's steps falter. He wore his finest civilian clothes, his bearing military straight, his smile cold enough to freeze hellfire. Behind him, his 3 men lounged with deceptive casualness, their eyes constantly scanning for threats or opportunities. Steady, dear. Widow Morrison murmured, taking Josie's arm. "Show him no fear." As they approached the church entrance, Marcus stepped forward with exaggerated courtesy. "Miss McGraw, how lovely you look. Almost like a real bride." "Colonel Whitfield," Josie kept her voice level despite the ice in her veins, "I trust you'll honor our agreement." "Of course. A gentleman always keeps his word." His gaze shifted to Emma, who had moved closer to Josie's skirts. "Hello, Emma. You've grown since I last saw you." The child said nothing, but her grip on the rag doll tightened visibly. Marcus's smile widened, as if her fear pleased him. "Shall we proceed?" he asked, gesturing toward the church doors. "I'm quite eager to see this touching ceremony concluded." The church was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. Every soul in Copper Hollow seemed to have turned out, along with neighbors from surrounding ranches who'd ridden in despite the early hour. The atmosphere crackled with tension barely contained beneath a veneer of celebration. Boone stood at the altar in his finest black suit, his massive frame somehow managing to look both imposing and vulnerable. When Josie appeared in the doorway, his expression transformed from barely controlled anxiety to something approaching wonder. She moved down the aisle with Emma at her side, the child's small hand gripping hers with fierce trust. Reverend Collins cleared his throat and began the familiar words, his voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Boone Carter and Josie McGraw in holy matrimony." The ceremony proceeded with careful formality, each word weighted with significance that went far beyond the usual promises of love and fidelity. When they reached the exchange of vows, Boone's voice was steady and strong. "I, Boone Carter, take you, Josie McGraw, to be my wife. I promise to protect you and cherish you, to stand by you in whatever trials may come." Josie's response was equally firm. "I, Josie McGraw, take you, Boone Carter, to be my husband. I promise to honor you and support you, to build something lasting together." As Boone reached into his pocket for the ring, his mother's simple gold band polished to a warm glow, the church doors burst open with a crash that echoed like thunder. Sheriff Hayes stumbled inside, his face flushed and his badge gleaming in the morning light. Behind him came 3 federal marshals, their authority unmistakable in their bearing and dress. "Stop this ceremony," Hayes called out, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I have warrants." Marcus Whitfield rose from his seat in the back pew, his face a mask of satisfaction. "Excellent timing, Sheriff. I was beginning to worry you might be late." "What is the meaning of this?" Reverend Collins demanded, his ministerial dignity ruffled by the interruption. The lead marshal stepped forward, a document in his hand. "Federal warrant for the arrest of Josie McGraw on charges of kidnapping a minor child across state lines. Also, a warrant for the arrest of Boone Carter on charges of aiding and abetting said kidnapping." Gasps echoed through the church. Emma pressed closer to Josie's skirts, her rag doll clutched tight against her chest. Boone moved instinctively to shield both of them, his body language shifting from groom to protector in an instant. "This is outrageous," Doc Henley called from the congregation. "These people are trying to protect a child from abuse." "The law is the law," the marshal replied. "Marcus Whitfield has legal custody of Emma Whitfield, and these individuals have violated federal statutes by removing her from his care." But before anyone could move to carry out the arrests, Emma herself stepped forward. Her small voice carried clearly through the church, cutting through the adult arguments with the pure clarity of childhood truth. "He hurt me," she said, pointing at Marcus with a trembling finger. "He hurt me when Aunt Josie wasn't watching. He said bad things and grabbed my arms too hard and made me cry." The marshal frowned, looking between the child and Marcus. "That's a serious accusation, young lady." "She's lying," Marcus said quickly. "Children often fantasize when they're upset about change." "No!" Emma's voice grew stronger, fed by righteous indignation. "I'm not lying. Show them, Aunt Josie. Show them the pictures." Josie's face went pale. "Emma," sweetheart. Show them the pictures you took of the bruises, the ones you hid in your special book." A murmur ran through the congregation. Doc Henley stepped forward, his medical authority giving weight to his words. "Marshal, if there's evidence of abuse, surely that changes the situation." "Pictures can be faked," Marcus said, but there was something desperate in his tone now. "Not these pictures," said a new voice from the back of the church. Everyone turned to see Hans Zimmermann enter, his wife Greta beside him, both carrying leather satchels that bulged with papers. "Hans," Josie breathed, "what are you doing here?" "Bringing evidence," the elderly German said firmly. "Evidence of what this man really is." Greta moved forward, her face set with determination. "We have been watching Marcus Whitfield for months, photographing his meetings, documenting his threats, recording his true business." "What business?" the marshal demanded. "Gun running," Hans said simply. "Selling weapons to Mexican revolutionaries. Very illegal, very profitable. Emma was never about custody. She was about keeping Josie quiet because she had seen too much." The church erupted in chaos. Marcus lunged toward the door, but found his way blocked by a wall of angry townspeople. His hired men reached for their weapons, only to discover that half the congregation had come armed and ready. Sheriff Hayes drew his gun with practiced efficiency. "Nobody moves. This is now a federal matter." In the midst of the confusion, Boone reached for his mother's ring, still clutched in his palm. Without hesitation, he took Josie's trembling hand and slipped the gold band onto her finger. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Collins called out over the chaos, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss that followed was brief but meaningful, sealing not just their legal union, but their shared commitment to protect the child who had brought them together. When they broke apart, Emma was beaming at them both, her rag doll forgotten as she clapped her small hands in delight. "Now you really are my family," she said with satisfaction. As the marshals moved to arrest Marcus and his men, as the evidence of his crimes spread through the gathered crowd, as justice finally seemed within reach, Boone Carter looked down at his new wife and stepdaughter and knew that sometimes the most unexpected promises were the ones most worth keeping. 3 months later, the first snow of winter dusted the peaks surrounding Copper Hollow, painting the landscape in shades of silver and white. Boone stood on the front porch of his house, their house now, watching Emma build a snowman in the front yard with the focused determination she brought to every task. The transformation of the Carter Ranch had been gradual but profound. Rooms that had stood empty for decades now echoed with laughter and conversation. Josie's belongings mingled with his family's heirlooms, creating a home that honored the past while embracing the future. Emma's childish drawings decorated the kitchen walls, alongside his mother's carefully preserved recipes. "Papa Boone," Emma called, using the name she'd settled on after much serious consideration. "Come help me with the snowman's face." The title still caught him off guard sometimes, filling his chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove crackling inside. He'd never expected to be anyone's father, had made peace with the solitude of his life. Now he couldn't imagine existing without Emma's chatter filling the morning hours or her small hand slipping into his when they walked to town. "Coming, sweetheart," he called back, but paused as Josie emerged from the house, carrying a tray of hot cocoa and wearing the contented expression that had replaced the haunted look in her eyes. "The mail came," she said, handing him a thick envelope bearing official seals. "The final custody papers." Boone examined the documents that formally made Emma their legal daughter. Marcus Whitfield's signature appeared at the bottom, scratched out from his federal prison cell, where he awaited trial on charges that would likely keep him incarcerated for the rest of his natural life. The gun-running evidence had proven even more extensive than Hans and Greta had initially revealed, connecting Marcus to a network of illegal arms dealers that stretched from Texas to Mexico. "She's really ours now," Josie said softly, watching Emma attempt to lift a snowball nearly as large as herself. "She was always ours," Boone replied, "from the moment she called me her protector in that Denver boarding house." They walked together toward Emma's construction project, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. The child had managed to create a remarkably ambitious snowman, complete with stick arms and a carrot nose that Pete Williams had donated from the root cellar. "It needs eyes," Emma announced, studying her creation with the critical gaze of an artist. "And maybe a hat." "I might have something," Boone said, disappearing into the house. He returned with his father's old work hat, a battered felt affair that had seen decades of use on the ranch. As he placed it carefully on the snowman's head, he felt the familiar weight of his father's pocket watch in his vest, still ticking steadily, still marking time, but no longer counting empty hours. "Perfect!" Emma clapped her mittened hands together. "Now he looks like a real rancher." That afternoon, they drove to town for the weekly shopping trip that had become a cherished family tradition. Emma chattered constantly from her seat between Boone and Josie, pointing out landmarks and waving to neighbors with the enthusiasm of someone who knew she belonged. At McKinnon's general store, Martha greeted them with the warmth she reserved for her favorite customers. "Afternoon, Mrs. Carter. How's married life treating you?" "Better than I ever expected," Josie replied, and Boone heard the truth in her voice. Their marriage had begun as a practical necessity, but it had grown into something deeper, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection that strengthened with each passing day. As they gathered their supplies, Emma discovered a new arrival in the store's small toy section, a wooden train set that immediately captured her imagination. Boone watched her examine each piece with the thoroughness she brought to everything, then carefully put it back when she thought no one was looking. "Santa might need to know about that train," he whispered to Josie, who smiled and made a mental note. Their final stop was Peterson's photography studio, where they'd arranged to have a family portrait taken. The photographer, a serious man with kind eyes, positioned them carefully in front of a painted backdrop depicting a peaceful countryside scene. "Hold still now," Peterson instructed, his head disappearing beneath the black cloth of his camera. "This needs to be perfect." As the flash powder ignited with its brief, brilliant flare, Boone felt time crystallize around them. This moment, Josie's hand resting on his shoulder, Emma perched on his knee with her rag doll, Molly clutched in her arms. All three of them, smiling with genuine happiness, would become the centerpiece of their family's story. Later that evening, after Emma had been tucked into bed with Molly and a story about brave princesses and gentle giants, Boone and Josie sat together on the front porch despite the cold. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, the same constellations that had witnessed his solitary vigils before their arrival. "Do you ever regret it?" Josie asked quietly. "The way everything changed so quickly?" Boone considered the question, thinking of the quiet life he'd led before that stagecoach brought her back to Copper Hollow. "A wise man once told me that some promises take years to fulfill properly. I think that little girl who said she'd marry me when she grew up knew something I didn't, that the best things in life are worth waiting for, even when they come with complications. Especially then." He pulled out his father's pocket watch, its familiar tick marking time in the darkness. "This belonged to my grandfather, then my father, and now it's mine." Each generation added their own scratches and dents, their own stories. I used to think that made it damaged, but now I understand those marks are what make it precious. "And us." Josie's voice carried a smile he could hear even in the darkness. "We're just adding our own story to the collection." He tucked the watch away and drew her closer. "Some promises take 16 years to fulfill, but they're worth every day of waiting." Inside the house, Emma's sleepy voice drifted through the windows as she talked to Molly about the day's adventures. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and joys, but tonight, Boone Carter sat with his wife and listened to their daughter's contented murmur, knowing that the empty rooms of his father's house had finally become a home filled with the laughter and love his parents had always dreamed of. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, marking time not as something lost, but as something gained, each second a gift, each minute a blessing, each hour a promise kept.